Well, welcome to the class. And the very first PowerPoint presentation that we're going to do, in which I'm going to talk about some issues to start thinking about for AP World History, is on argumentation. And here's what I mean by argumentation. Argumentation is really about class discussion and being able to get involved in the classes that you're going to be in order to have your own original argument, your own original voice be a part of the classroom. And I know this can be really difficult for a lot of students. Some students, these kinds of things just come naturally to, and for them, speaking up in class is just normal for them on a daily basis. And we probably all know that experience of the one guy in the room or the one young girl in the room who constantly has their hand up in the air. And maybe that's not you. That's just not your way of doing things. And I totally understand that. In fact, there are two types of personalities in the world, generally speaking. There's the extrovert who gains a whole bunch of energy from getting involved and talking to people. And there's the introvert who tends to need time to go away somewhere and to think and process issues. So don't feel bad about what kind of person you are. To be quite honest, we all have our different talents and skills and abilities, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. However, within the advanced placement classroom, it is so important that you stretch yourself a little bit. So if you're an extrovert, this might come naturally. If you're an introvert, it might seem a little weird to do. But here's what you want to do. You want to start stretching yourself. Why? What's the upside to doing this? Because as you do this on a daily basis, you'll get better at it, and that will allow you to make better arguments. And in the end, you're going to have to make those arguments, whether it's out loud or if it's down on paper. So this first PowerPoint is going to give you a little bit of that overview about how do you construct an original argument, whether it be on the spot or if it be through some really good critical thinking. So the first thing that I'm sure most of you guys are aware of is bad arguments. I'm sure we've all heard them, we've all been involved in them, and I know for myself, I've given them. Bad arguments are pretty easy to make, but we want to try and stay away from them as much as possible. So we want to have some rules that we should know about when a bad argument is being given. So to start off with, a bad argument is an argument that's too vague, or it's too specific and narrow. Another problem for a lot of arguments is lacking in support. I'm sure we hear arguments all the time, whether it's with family and friends, or if it's on the television set, or if it's within our classroom, in which somebody gives an argument and they don't back it up with enough examples, or the examples that they're using are really insignificant, or what we call insufficient. And then the last part of a bad argument that we can usually tell is when it lacks a clear analysis to tell the reader why the argument is being made in the first place. So then what is a good argument? Well, a good argument is going to provide a clear and specific opinion, but we can't stop there. Everybody's got opinions. The question is whether or not you can provide sufficient support to those opinions to demonstrate that the opinion really is capable of being backed up. And then last up, we want some analysis afterwards that connects the argument together with the evidence and states the overall significance to the argument. So here are three basic elements to any argument you're going to make, and I don't care what class it is. It can be in history, it could be in English, it can be in science or in math. Every argument basically boils down to these three elements. First off, a claim. Everybody's got these. They're basically opinions. But next up, we need support for our claims, and that's what we call a warrant. There are two types of warrants we can use. One would be a concrete warrant, which is a specific type of warrant, or an example or a statistic. Another type is an analytical warrant. That's where we give a reason that helps to support our overall argument. And then the last thing we want to do is provide an impact or analysis in which we're going to give significance about our argument. So please remember, three basic elements to any argument you always want to have: a claim, a warrant, and an impact. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are probably thinking, well, does that mean that I always have to have three separate sentences? No, not necessarily, although to be quite honest, when you're developing your arguments and eventually when you're writing down arguments, you're probably going to have more than just three sentences. You're probably going to provide that claim which you can oftentimes for your warrants. You're probably going to have multiple examples that are well described, and then you're going to finish off with some kind of analysis at the end. Really good writers find a way to overlap some of these things. So they'll start off with a topic sentence, they'll give examples with significant statements right up to them, and they have some kind of transition at the end of it. So there's a variety of ways of doing these kinds of argumentation, but the most important thing you want to remember is that there are three parts: the claim, the warrant, and the impact. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. We'll start off with a bad example here, and this would be a way to persuade your parents. So I'm sure your parents are just going to love me when they start to hear that I'm giving you this kind of advice. Let's take, for example, if you were to go up to your parents and say, hey, you know something? There's this party on Saturday night that I need to go to, and your entire argument is, I really just want to see my friends this Saturday. Well, good luck with that argument. That might work out well if your parents trust you and trust the party that you're going to. My guess is that argument's not going to go very far. But let's change that up and apply our claim, warrant, and impact argument to it and see if this helps out. This is a better way to persuade your parents. Hopefully, maybe they're not listening in at this point. Otherwise, they might be a little upset with me. So your claim, you know something, Mom, Dad, the reason why I want to go to parties is because they're necessary for social networking. Ah, yes, social networking, absolutely. So there's our claim, right? That the reason why we go to parties is not just for the fun, but there's actually an added benefit to it, an advantage for you to go to these parties. So parties are necessary for social networking. Okay, as a parent, I'm not so sure about this, but okay, I'll listen to the rest of this. So here's our warrant, and our warrant is actually, this time around, it's going to be a concrete warrant. It's a statistic. 90% of people who go to social engagements make significant connections. That's a pretty good warrant. It's pretty sufficient, so that works out well. And then we're going to finish off with our analysis or our impact. Going to this party is going to help me to practice my overall social skills. So for all the introverts out there, this is a really good argument you can make with your parents about why you ought to go to parties. So notice what I've given here, 3 separate specific sections here: the claim, social networking, the warrant, the 90% of people, and the impact. Okay, this is going to really improve my social skills. So I'm sure you're wondering, okay, great, Zucker, that sounds really cool for trying to persuade my parents about a party, but how does this really apply to a history class that I'm going to be taking in September? So let's say that you get this prompt. So in AP World History, you're not going to be given what's called questions. You're going to be given what's called prompts. And the reason why they're prompts is because they're not really a question or a question mark to them, but rather given a statement that you have to analyze. So let's take this one. Analyze how humans manipulated their natural environment in order to develop a social hierarchy during the era of human origin. So this is in the chapters that you read for this week. So here's a really kind of poor example for starting off. Humans developed new ways to manage nature in order to change their social hierarchies. Okay, this is just really vague. It doesn't tell me much, okay, as far as my overall claim is going to go, right? So I need something a little bit more specific to get me started. Humans created new metals for the use of farming and thus needed classes of landowners and laborers. Notice that this is really specific and it gives me a sense of where this argument is going to go historically. At the same time, there's a lot of evidence that I can use off of this, and it's really delving into different parts of the argument, plus it's answering all parts of the prompt. So I've got here that we created new metals. There's my technological aspect of the environment, okay, the use of farming, classes of landowners, laborers. There's our social hierarchy. Okay, so next up, we don't want to forget the support. Remember what we talked about here. You want to have warrants. Either we're going to give concrete warrants or we're going to give analytical warrants, right? So in AP World History, one of the things I always suggest during the year is something called the Rule of 3. So what is the Rule of 3? Try to provide 3 specific examples to back up your claim. Now, one big thing I make for all during the year is this. Whenever I say something, rule of 3, it's probably not the best wording to use. It's just the easiest to remember. There really is no rule for writing. It's not as if in the end, if you don't have 3 examples, you're going to get in big trouble. It's more like a guideline or an ideal that you want to try and hit for to every argument you want to try and give about 3. Why 3? The brain really works pretty well with 3 for some reason. We don't really know why, but 3 is actually a pretty good number to use. The other thing that 3 is really good for is you're giving a variety of different supports, so that way you're more sufficient. Okay, so let's go ahead and brainstorm some examples that we could use here that we read in the first chapter or two. Metallurgy, for example, one of the things that we got from the first couple chapters, new forms of metal for farming. Some social issues would be managing river systems like the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates, and then out of that comes the social issues of the class system, okay, the big man leader, warriors, bureaucrats, landowners, and laborers. So here's what we can do then to provide those examples in order to provide our rule of 3. Humans started to melt minerals into iron tools that they could use for farming and creating food surpluses. Okay, there's our manipulation of the environment. But this required water from river systems like the Tigris and Euphrates, environment. So they created new governmental leaders and bureaucratic offices to manage land holdings and laborers. There's our social aspect. So notice here that I've got 3 examples here. And you might notice too that I'm already starting into analysis a little bit. So the good thing about this kind of an example is it's giving me specifics. It hits rule of 3. It's describing them. And it's already starting to go into the significance and the analysis. So why are we doing this? So this is where we get to that analysis aspect and the significance. All arguments have to answer, what's the important part of this? What's significance? Okay, how do we know that we're hitting significance? you're answering the question. The prompt asks about how the environment relates to the creation of social organizations. So in your argument at the end with your analysis, you want to make sure that you provide that. You want to say, okay, how is the environment impacting? How does this create different types of social relationships? So here's a really good example. The use of rivers and land to create food surpluses for population growth led to new forms of governments and economic labor. So there we go. Here's our environment, rivers and lands for food surpluses, and the social relationship, new forms of governments, economic labor. So, some big takeaways, and whenever we finish up these PowerPoints over the next few weeks, I'm always going to end off these with what I call takeaways, and these are the big things I want you to remember for this class and during the year as we get into AP World History. Remember that all arguments require 3 levels of argumentation: the claim, the warrant, and the impact. Again, are these 3 specific sentences? Not necessarily. It could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less. We do want to try and hit that rule of 3 for support, so we're probably going to have a good deal of sentences. We want to try and make sure we provide specific arguments. We might make sure an argument should not be too narrow or too vague. We want to make sure that the argument is specific, it answers all parts of the question. And then last off, an argument needs to provide a specific opinion that's supported and tells me why we are answering the prompt. So in the end, what you're trying to do, whether you're doing it vocally or if you're doing it in writing, is you want to have multi-layers to your argument. You want to make sure you state a clear opinion. You want to make sure you have a lot of good support. Let's see why that opinion is really big. And let me finish with this. This is something that I'm going to be stressing all year with my classes. AP World History is not a class of just memorizing tons of facts. AP World History is about making arguments. It's about using themes and thinking skills and evidence to make your own original argument. The sooner you start raising your hand and getting involved with that, the better off you're going to be. Are you going to make mistakes? Yes, absolutely. But that's how we learn. So please get involved in your AP World History class. Use some of these things that we're talking about here. Become more of critical thinking and start offering your arguments. I'm sure you're going to do a great job and you're going to get into that learning curve very quickly.